Hi, everyone. Today we are going to sort of springboard out of what we have been learning about Russia and start looking at some of the surrounding countries. I think on the schedule I might have written that we were going to learn about the USSR, Ukraine, and Romania. We're actually going to be learning about Ukraine and Armenia and the USSR, just because Armenia has some pretty interesting history that has also come up in more recent months. So we're going to talk about that. So first of all, the USSR. Some of you might be more familiar with this than others. It is a fascinating political thing that happened, but we're not going to get too into the details. We're just going to kind of give a brief overview and then get into the details of some specific countries. All right, so the USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the capital was in Moscow, and they governed the Soviet or the Communist Party. They governed some of the surrounding countries that are on your map there. So it formed as a sovereign state governed by the Communist Party with the capital in Moscow. And we talked about, or you watched the documentary that talked about the October Revolution and Lenin's rise to power and things like that. And so this is sort of where the USSR gets its roots. So as the czars are all killed, a new political system is coming into power. However, that did not always go very smoothly. I know that the documentary mentioned that some people were having a little bit of a hard time figuring out how this new political system was going to work. They liked the idea of having a czar and another form of government, but that wasn't really viable. And so what ended up happening is that, well, obviously there were a lot of things that happened, but one of them that happened was the Great Purge. So in order to suppress some political uprising, the Communist Party rounded up anyone who was suspected of political sabotage or espionage and executed everybody without a trial. And so this, on the one hand, helped quell some uprisings. There were some revolutions happening, but it also made the people very frightened of this new form of government, which is part of how you get this reputation of the Soviet Union as having a very violent or dark reputation, right? And that starts way before the Great Purge. But this is definitely one of those things that the government has been established, but now they're going to continue using some of their more violent tactics to strengthen the government, right? So during World War II, this is also something that we don't usually hear about in our history classes, but during World War II, the Soviet Union actually suffered the highest number of casualties. They suffered somewhere between 22 and 28 million. The exact number is really hard to pin down. And this was after Germany invaded. We don't usually think about this because we're a lot more concerned with learning about Germany in France and Germany bombing England and Germany versus the US and Italy and things like that. But Germany invaded large sections of the USSR and they suffered way more casualties. The USA only suffered 420,000 approximately casualties in World War II. Other things that you may have heard of, Mikhail Gorbachev, he was the last leader of the Soviet Union. So we're getting to we've studied how it started and sort of the middle-ish era, and now we're getting to the end of the USSR. Gorbachev was the last leader of the Soviet Union and the general secretary of the Communist Party. By the time he got to be president, it was pretty clear that things were going downhill. He tried to restabilize this union between these various countries by establishing sort of this idea of openness. And he was like, well, maybe we can restructure it. But the political instability was too deep. There were uprisings in various countries, and he eventually resigned in 1991. And the Supreme Soviet, so the powers even higher than Gorbachev, they decided we just need to cut our losses now. We're going to dissolve the USSR. And that was that. You might have also heard of Gorbachev because of the famous quote, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, talking about the Berlin Wall, which fell in 1989. So he was the one in power when that actually came down. A few interesting fun facts about the USSR. So the first one, Gorbachev, um, part of his whole shtick was that idea of openness and, hey, I'm just like you guys. And he actually ended up recording his own music album of romantic ballads. So you can look that up if you want, although I cannot recommend it too highly as I have not listened to the whole thing myself. The Grapes of Wrath, some of you might be familiar with this. This is a book that then there was a movie made of it. It's by Steinbeck. And The Grapes of Wrath, the movie takes place in the United States. And it was actually banned in the USSR because people complained that the way that it was depicting struggling families was ridiculous because the people who were supposedly struggling and didn't have money still had food, still had cars, and things like that. And the people of the USSR said that is not true. People who are struggling don't have any of these things. Most of the people in this country don't have those things. That's not cool. Another fun fact, which there's some debate about how real this is, but we do know that it's partially real, but the KGB could detect American spies from the staples in their passports because people who were Americans who were posing as Russians, um, their passports would still be made in the United States, and the quality of the metal in the USA was so much higher that they wouldn't rust as quickly, whereas the quality of metal in the USSR was so poor that they would rust almost immediately after the passports had been made. All right, so that's all about the USSR. We're going to talk about Ukraine. That's the Ukrainian flag. We're not really going to chat about the flag, but here we go. The capital of Ukraine is Kiev. And that's an important one to know. It does come up in the news and in literature quite a bit. Also, Kiev was an important part in the USSR. So if you're hearing about the USSR pre 90s, Kiev is often talked about as a capital, even though it wasn't the capital of the USSR. From the USSR days, there's still a lot of people who speak Russian. Actually, about 30% of the Ukrainian population are native Russian speakers rather than native Ukrainian speakers. All right, religion in Ukraine. So Ukraine is 75% Orthodox Christian and 23% Catholic. So a very large percentage of the population is religious, which is pretty interesting. When we talk about religion anywhere in Russia or the former USSR, the numbers are usually pretty impressive, especially considering that during the times that the countries were ruled by communists, religion was banned. There are still a ton of beautiful churches. They were seen as sort of cultural icons, but the practice of religion was not allowed. So Ukraine is known for some beautiful churches and cathedrals. St. Sophia's Cathedral is a pretty famous one. It was built in the 11th century. You'll notice the slightly different architectural style than you might see in, say, places like Notre Dame or more Western European churches. We're going to talk about Ukraine kind of under the USSR control and then also some other important historical moments. So just kind of generally, Ukraine really suffered under Soviet control for a lot of reasons, but a few of the ways were the language Ukrainian was forbidden to be taught in schools. Nobody was supposed to still be speaking it. The language did survive, but this is why you have such a high percentage of Russian speakers in Ukraine. The capital, so Moscow and the head of the USSR, they imposed an artificial famine on Ukraine, not letting them keep the goods that they were producing or ship in extra food, which is pretty brutal to do on any place, especially a country that you claim to be part of your union. Also, during World War II, Ukraine was hit very hard by the German invasion, and approximately 1 million Ukrainian Jews were killed. And as if that isn't tragic enough, we also have Chernobyl, which happened on April 26, 1986. A reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. which spewed nuclear reactive material pretty much everywhere. People in surrounding areas were exposed to extreme radiation. And one of the nearby cities, Pripyat, 31 people died immediately. The explosion was on Soviet territory, but the regime ignored it. They knew about it, but they did nothing. And this was a pretty big deal. Even in a wool processing plant 50 miles away, women were exposed to more radiation in a minute than is considered safe for a human to be exposed to in a year. Even the wool that these women were working with was exposed to so much radiation that the women were essentially handling turned on x-ray machines as their job, which is super dangerous. And a lot of people in the surrounding area were exposed to very dangerous levels of radiation. In the map, you can see that is a map of Europe. Chernobyl is labeled there, and obviously that's hit hard, but you also have dark red areas up into Finland, Sweden, Norway, even parts of the UK and Italy because of wind patterns. So it was actually Sweden, not the USSR, who first acknowledged the Chernobyl disaster. As you could see in that map, parts of Sweden were hit super hard because of the way weather patterns work. They picked up the radiation on their alarms, and they approached the USSR and they said, hey, this is an actual disaster, you need to do something. But the regime still denied the disaster until Sweden threatened to file an official alert with the International Atomic Energy Authority. After that happened, the USSR finally realized that they kind of had to do something about it. And so what they decided was that they would grant people liquidator status. Now, liquidator, that means people who were affected by radiation. They could get tested or they could testify that because of radiation I was exposed to, my body has stopped being able to do this or things like that. 600,000 people were granted liquidator status. That's 600,000. And Chernobyl is said to have been a large influencer in the fall of the USSR because of their incompetence in dealing with this disaster. Well, at first they ignored it and then they tried to deal with it, but at that point it was pretty late. And also, what are you going to do? But people were so unhappy with it, and people would be granted this status and would sort of get financial reparation for it, but not. People argue that it really wasn't enough to counter the damage that had been done. So in more recent history in Ukraine, it doesn't get too much happier. So in the early 2010s, pro-Russian rebels fought against Ukrainian armed forces and many people fled the violence. All right, so a few fun facts about Ukraine, which we've mostly talked about the sad stuff, but here's a few fun things. They have a president, prime minister, and parliament, which is a very unusual form of government. Also, Ukraine is the largest country entirely in Europe, and it has Europe's second largest military. All right, and as if we haven't learned enough sad things, we are also going to talk about Armenia. The capital is Yerevan. It has a population of approximately 11,500 square miles. Population almost 3 million. They use the Armenian dram. They speak Armenian. Also, they speak Assyrian, Greek, Russian, and Yazidi Kurdish. The Kurds are going to become more relevant when we study the Middle East. All right, so religion in Armenia. They are almost 100% Orthodox Christian. Most of the time when we talk about Christians in the Eastern Hemisphere, especially when we're talking about Russia or anywhere associated with the USSR, there are a lot of Orthodox Christians, which if you don't know about Orthodox Christianity, I would definitely suggest you looking it up a little bit more or talking to Mr. Ian. Also, the Ottoman Empire was mostly Muslim, so it is interesting that you have such a high percentage of Christians in Armenia because Armenia used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. Armenia was the first officially Christian state to come out of that, which is pretty interesting. Equally interesting, but definitely more sad, is the Armenian genocide. So, the Armenian genocide happened, it started April 24, 1915, and lasted until about 1923. There were only about 2 million Armenians to begin with, but what happened was there was a systematic mass extermination and expulsion of 1.5 million ethnic Armenians within the Ottoman Empire by the Ottoman government. So the Turkish government was careful to not allow any photography or reporting on the genocide. News actually reached the outside world from the accounts of US diplomats and missionaries who were able to document what was happening. So, for a long time, people didn't know about what was happening. And then, because of the lack of reporting on it, there was a lot of speculation that maybe this isn't real. Maybe this is, maybe they were mistaken. Maybe they're wrong. Things like that. And it was actually missionaries and diplomats who were not even supposed to, they're not supposed to report on things, but they were the ones who got the story out. All right, so the Armenian genocide is a little bit complicated for a few reasons, and we are going to get into that. So, according to the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment for the Crime of Genocide, very long name, genocide is defined as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Obviously, what happened in Armenia is genocide by that definition, but here is the issue. Number one, Turkey denies the genocide. Number two, the definition for genocide and that whole convention was not put into place until years after it happened. Also, Turkey is still a current country. It's still a current political power. And so the fact that, it was the Ottoman Empire, it's still Turkey, okay? And so there's a lot more at stake when countries are deciding whether or not they acknowledge the Armenian genocide as a genocide. Because if you do, that means that you are suddenly condemning Turkey, which is still a current political entity, right? Turkey accepts that bad things happen. They're like, yeah, it wasn't good what happened in Armenia, but it wasn't a genocide. Unlike the Holocaust, Nazi Germany is not a thing anymore. Germany is still there, but the Nazi regime has died. So countries are still allied with Turkey, and admitting genocide really harms foreign relations. The USA only formally recognized the Armenian genocide on October 29, 2019. That is less than a year ago. That was a few months, a month, 2 months, 1.5 months. I can't do math. A little bit after school started this year. Okay. So it is a big deal whether or not countries acknowledge this, because there's a bigger political risk to acknowledging the Armenian genocide than to, say, acknowledging the Holocaust, right? That was dark, but there's also Mount Ararat, which is super important to Armenians, which is interesting because Mount Ararat is actually not in Armenia. It's on the other side of the border. It's in Turkey. But Ararat, you should hopefully recognize it because it is where Noah's Ark came to rest in Genesis. So it is a very important Armenian symbol. They see it as a landmark that sort of belongs to them, despite the fact that it's not in Armenia. Some fun facts. So, Armenia was that first country to officially declare its national religion to be Christianity. The first math textbook was written in Armenia. And chess is a compulsory subject in all schools. All students are required to take chess. This is something that became really popular in the Soviet era, but also has remained alive, and students are forced to learn in schools. They think it teaches a lot of good life skills. I know that some of you have probably never played chess at all, and I won't make you do it as homework, but if you're bored during quarantine, go ahead and play a game of chess. You might learn something. All right, so that is the USSR, Ukraine, and Armenia with some touchdowns in some pretty historical moments. So hopefully you learned something. Don't forget to answer the questions after the video. Hang in there, you guys.